Much is often made of London's lost rivers, like the Tyburn, Fleet and Walbrook. Yet Newcastle upon Tyne also has rivers we cannot see. Ours are not lost, however, rather they're simply buried. The Skinnerburn, Erick Burn, Pandon Burn, Lam Burn and Lort Burn all continue to flow beneath the city down to the mighty Tyne. Burn obviously being a local word for river. The Lort Burn is perhaps the most well-known of the buried rivers. Originally called the Dene Burn, it gained its new name of Lort Burn in the later 14th century. Most sources agree that Lort means filth or excrement or words of that description, although some disagree as to whether it is an Old Norse word or an Old English word. The story of the Tyne and the Hidden Rivers of Newcastle gives the rough route of the Lort Burn, so in this episode I followed it as best I can given the current street layout, picking up the ghost stories and legends that lie along its route as a form of folklore meets psychogeography. So let's go and have a look at what we can find along the route of the Lort Burn. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are wrapping up the folklore of freshwater this week with the Lort Burn, although if you hear the way some people describe it, calling it freshwater might be a little bit of a stretch. And this is another one of the episodes, a bit like the one I did with the Walbrook, where I followed the route of the river and took photos and actually some video as I went. So if you are watching this on YouTube, you will be able to see the images. If you listen to the podcast episode, the images are on the blog post, so you can still see them, and hopefully it will make some sense to you. I do understand, of course, that Newcastle is less well known than London. However, I would argue that the route of the Walbrook probably goes through a part of London that people might not be that familiar with. So therefore, you should hopefully be able to just get on board with this one in Newcastle. And I think you all know me well enough by now to know how much I'm very proud of Newcastle and its history. So it is quite nice for me to be able to do something like this on home turf. Now it all kicks off in Leiss Park, which is a green oasis of calm beneath the football fanaticism of St James's Park to the west and the hubbub of the Royal Victoria Infirmary to the east. It's Grade 2 listed and Newcastle's first public park, which opened in 1873. Now the word Leiss comes from an Old English word that meant pasture or meadow. It was originally part of the town moor that I do have a separate episode on, but it's then been separated from the town moor and turned specifically into a park. So if you are in the park and you go to the lake, if you sort of head up towards the children's playground, you'll find a metal sculpture that looks like water splashing. And as far as I can tell from following the book The Story of the Tyne, this is where the Lort Burn first rises underground, somewhere where this sculpture is. And the artwork was actually put in to help commemorate the river's presence, which is quite cool. And once you find that, you'll then find metal slabs inset with flowers that mark the route of the burn from the sculpture down to the metal railings at the side of the lake. And there are flowers on the railing which mark the specific point where the burn flows into the lake. When I was there, you could actually see the outflow pipe because the lake was really quite low because we hadn't really had a huge amount of rain at that point, although the last couple of days have more than made up for that, but never mind. These particular slabs do continue on the other side of the lake to show the route of the burn as it flows out of the park and then down Richardson Road. So they are quite helpful to find, and it does sort of give you a slightly different perspective of the park to know that the Lort Burn is flowing somewhere underneath it. And that also helps to explain, I think, why there's so much fish in Leiss Park Lake, because quite a lot of people do like fishing in there. But once you're out on Richardson Road, you basically follow that street and then turn left onto Queen Victoria Road, and then you turn right into St Thomas's Street, which was built in 1842. I'll be honest, it's not a massively exciting street, so I'm not going to dwell on it that much. At least its neighbouring street, St Thomas's Crescent, was home to pre-Raphaelite artist William Bell Scott for a while, but I just essentially used this street to get from A to B. So the river does flow down beneath it, but that's about all I can say about it. The route of the river does get a little bit tangled up at the bottom of the street where it meets Percy Street, and yes, that is named after the Percy family, and I have mentioned Harry Hotspur, another one of the Percys, in the football episode, surprisingly enough. The shopping behemoth that is Elden Square lies opposite the bottom of St Thomas's Street, and that makes it really hard to follow any exact route of the Lort Burn, and I found 2 or 3 different sources which gave a slightly different route, so I've basically just followed this part as best I can. So I chose to follow Percy Street west and then into Blackett Street, because according to Ken Smith and Tom Yellowly, the Lort Burn passed the holy well of St Bartholomew's nunnery in this area. Now, the Granger Market now stands on the site of this nunnery, which helps to explain nearby Nun Street and Nuns Lane. And Smith and Yellowly also explain that an earlier butcher's market actually stood on the site of the nunnery over the burn. Now, while Nun Street is a little bit further over from where we are, the area is worth a slight tangent because it involves a secret tunnel. So we're back into the folklore, people. And St Bartholomew's nunnery allegedly had secret tunnels to both Blackfriars and Greyfriars. I'm sure we had something like 4 monasteries and a convent in the city at some point, which seems a bit excessive. But as I say, the nunnery supposedly had tunnels to the 2 nearest monasteries. But what is a little bit peculiar is the fact that there is a ghostly nun who's seen walking at street level near Blackfriars, which you seem to think, well, surely if she was walking from one to the other, you wouldn't need a tunnel. But there we go. But in this particular story, one of the monks at Blackfriars and one of the nuns at St Bartholomew's fell in love. And you can imagine what the result of this was. And when the nun became pregnant, she was bricked up alive in the convent as punishment. Her ghost apparently wanders in Nuns Lane. Nobody really knows for definite what actually happened to the monk, but there are ghostly monks seen walking through the wall at Blackfriars, so who knows, he might have been punished as well. But back to the actual route that I was following. So I mentioned before that I turned into Blackett Street, and Blackett Street runs along the south side of Old Elden Square. Now, the only original buildings that remain of this square, which would have looked really, really quite fancy when it was built, stand to the east of the square because the north and west sides were demolished to build the shopping centre. Now, the square has had several alternative names over the years, with the Hippie Green and Goth Green being 2 of the most common because the alternative community used to hang out there. And yes, that did include me in my younger years. But Old Elden Square is also the site of a pretty funny story dating to the time before the redevelopment of the area in the 1820s. So this particular spot was actually something of a wasteland used as a rubbish dump and a manure heap. And one day some workmen came to take some of the manure and they unearthed a child's body. They assembled a coroner and a jury, sure that they were going to need an inquest to investigate. But luckily, the coroner was a surgeon. And when he examined the body, he realised it wasn't a child at all, it was actually a wooden doll. And it turned out that the former theatre royal manager had kept stage props in his house, and when he retired, he just dumped them all in the rubbish dump because he didn't need them anymore, and the doll had then ended up in the manure heap to be unearthed by these workmen. So at least that story ended quite well, and they must have been quite relieved that they hadn't discovered a body at all, and it was just this former stage prop. But I thought that was quite funny. From this point in the route, I then actually cut through Elden Square from Blackett Street to Clayton Street and then went on into the Granger Market. It was absolutely heaving, and it was really nice to see it so busy for a change because it has had quite a lot of challenges in recent years. But I must admit, I do miss both Robinson's The Bookshop and Scorpio Shoes, both of which are no longer there. But for those who remember Robinson's, it was actually originally founded in 1881, but there was actually a short period of a few weeks in 2000 when it seemed a ghost had popped by. The shop's owner would lock up every night, but then you would find that the stock had moved when you opened up the next morning. Some books even lay open as if they were being read. While nothing went missing, it was obviously quite a weird experience for him, but even more weird, it all stopped only a few weeks later, and it has never been explained. So I thought that was quite interesting. And let's be honest, if you are going to haunt somewhere, a bookshop sounds like a pretty good place to do it. But we're going to leave the Granger Market and then turn left along Granger Street to the junction with Market Street. And this marks the point where the Lam Burn, which begins somewhere under St Andrew's Church on Gallowgate, joins the Lort Burn. It is quite difficult to figure out the route at this point because apparently it flowed over Nuns Fields and past Anderson Place, but the buildings in the area do make this quite hard to follow. And it is quite hard to picture it now, but a grand house once stood roughly where Lloyd's Bank is now at the top of Grey Street. And originally the site of Greyfriars, which I mentioned earlier, Robert Anderson bought the land in 1580 and then built New House. Charles I spent time there under house arrest, although he was occasionally taken to Shieldfield to play golf. Now, according to legend, Charles tried to escape from New House in a boat down the Lort Burn, and a ship was waiting for him down on the Tyne. His escape attempt failed because he ran into a grill that was blocking the sewer into which the burn ran, and his captors recovered him. He allegedly haunts the quayside still searching for his rescue ship, but I don't know anyone who's ever actually seen him. New House passed through various hands until a new owner renamed it Anderson Place in 1801. and Richard Granger then bought it in 1833 and demolished it to make way for his grand plans for the area. And I think if you've ever spent any kind of time hanging around the monument, you will find it really difficult to think a mansion once stood here, because it's so hard to imagine, and that is why I've put an image of it on screen. But if you look back up Grey Street from Market Street, you will see Grey's monument, and that honours Charles Earl Grey, the only Northumbrian to be Prime Minister. He passed the Reform Act in 1832, which extended the electoral franchise, and he also passed the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833, which abolished slavery within the British Empire. Now, the statue actually lost its head in 1941 after a lightning strike, and he didn't get another one until 1947, which does create a bit of a weird mental image that Earl Grey was standing up there with no head for like 6 years, which I thought was quite interesting. And Grey's monument has itself served as something of a lightning rod for activism in the city for decades, being the preferred location for protests and demonstrations. Now, the area where the monument now stands before Anderson Place was the site of Greyfriars, and this Tinside Cinema now stands on this parcel of land, and there are various reports of haunting in the cinema. Cleaners have described finding seats that they left upright suddenly folded down, and a figure in dark robes apparently loiters in the corners. Other people have seen a similar figure upstairs in the Electra. They've felt a presence when they should have been on their own, or they've even heard someone clearing their throat in an empty room. Now, I must admit, when I was actually on a call to marketing staff at the cinema about an event, I had suggested that they include tales of the ghost during said event. And I sort of meant the ghostly monk, because I'd also heard that another one apparently sits in the Roxy and watches films in there. And the woman then replied and went, "Oh, the Victorian woman?" So I was like, oh, no, I didn't know that there was one. So clearly there are several spectres at the Tyneside Cinema. And again, if you're going to haunt anywhere for perpetuity, I reckon a bookstore or a cinema is a good place to do that. Now, a little bit further down, the Theatre Royal stands at the junction of Grey Street and Market Street. It opened in 1837, although it has been extensively remodelled and restored since then. It's also reputedly haunted by a Grey Lady, who I have talked about before, so obviously there is a separate episode about the Grey Lady of the Theatre Royal. The sweep of Grey Street and down into Dean Street marks the approximate location of a deep ravine or Dene that once cut Newcastle into two districts. And this is where the Lort Burn becomes much more apparent, and how it's then affected the layout of the streets and so on in this area, because the Lort Burn ran along this Dene on its way to the Tyne below. Grey Street was built in the 1830s, originally called Upper Dean Street. And Richard Granger, the architect, had intended Grey Street to be the main shopping street in the city. Granger's plan saw the central station situated at the foot of the street. Unfortunately, they couldn't level the land enough, so the station's location moved to its present site on Neville Street. So Grey Street never quite became the shopping destination, but because of its fabulous architecture, it does often win all these various awards about being Britain's greatest street and stuff like that. And that's all despite the presence of the Lort Burn, because Granger buried it to create Grey Street. The Dene was deep enough that filling it in during the 1830s needed 250,000 cartloads of waste, and this filled the 30 feet necessary to level the site. And that tells you how deep the Dene actually was, that they needed that much waste in order to culvert the river and then put the infill in order to create like a level playing field, as it were, for the buildings above. Now, the depth of the Dene actually also helped to protect the castle, since anyone attacking from the east would also need to somehow cross the ravine. And as it was, there were only two main crossings across the Dene, and the first was the Upper Dene Bridge, which was roughly where we now find the street called High Bridge. The flesh market was just south of the bridge, and people threw offal and other waste from the market into the burn here. So one side of High Bridge connects Grey Street with Pilgrim Street, and the other side, which is where you'll find things like the Comedy Club, the Stand, that particular half of High Bridge connects Grey Street with the big market. So that one's become a little bit more of a popular thoroughfare, I think, in recent years. So the course of the Lort Burn then follows Grey Street down and across Mosley Street before it then goes down Dean Street. And development in the area in the 1780s saw the creation of Mosley Street and Dean Street. But even at this point, people regarded the Lort Burn as a sewer, so burying it beneath the street probably brought some relief from the smell. I always find this quite interesting when people complain about a river being an open sewer, yet they continue to throw waste into it. And you think, well, you are helping to contribute to the problem there, so maybe stop throwing waste into it. But I digress. There is a strange dip in the road at Mosley Street, which is one of the few street level indicators that the Lort Burn is still here. And as an aside, Mosley Street was actually the first street in the UK lit with electric lighting because Joseph Swan, inventor of the light bulb, worked a shop on Mosley Street. And before anyone comes at me and goes, oh no, it wasn't, it was Thomas Edison that invented the light bulb, that is a really long debate that I'm not really prepared to get into on a folklore podcast, but there is a lot of evidence to show that Swan actually came up with the concept first. And that's all I'm going to say on that one. But then we're going to cross over Mosley Street and get on to Dene Street, and there's a little bit more to have a look at here, because partway down Dene Street you'll find a pair of staircases opposite each other on either side of the street. One of them is marked Low Bridge, and this marks the site of the bridge over the Lort Burn, sometimes called Nether Dene Bridge, so this was the second crossing over the ravine. The stairs now take you up onto Pilgrim Street, and the Nether Dene Bridge itself was actually removed in 1787. The Tyne is tidal, and the tide actually flowed up the Lort Burn as far as Low Bridge. Some sources suggested it actually flowed as high as High Bridge, and that merchants used small boats to reach the old nearby flesh market. Now, my mum actually remembered an old phrase, when the ship sails up Dene Street, used as a response to children who asked for unlikely things. So you might ask for something and say, oh, can I have X, Y, or Z? And then your parent would go, yes, when the ship sails up Dene Street, as if it's that kind of impossible thing that couldn't happen. But, you know, the whole pigs might fly kind of idea we had when the ship sails up Dene Street. But it's quite funny because at some point ships did sail up Dene Street, at least before it was Dene Street. So that is quite an amusing little snippet of local lore that I thought was worth preserving there. Now, I did say there was a pair of staircases, and the other one is Cathedral Stairs, which leads between Cathedral Buildings and Milburn House to the back of St Nicholas's Cathedral. And this is the one where, if you ever see footage of the famous Thunder Thursday and there's this water spout being created, it was because the Lort Burn had overflowed at this point and was essentially meeting water that was coming down Cathedral Stairs. We are going to take a little bit of a detour here because I had to, and you'll see why in a second. Because if you go up Cathedral Stairs, if you turn to your left at the top of the stairs, you'll see a bust of Thomas Buick. And that's because his workshop was somewhere in this area. Obviously, it's long since gone, but we know that's the approximate location of it. And this famed engraver and natural history author actually spent quite a large part of his career in that particular workshop. Now, we have briefly met him in the Cows and Folklore episode thanks to his engraving The Wild Bull, featuring one of the Chillingham cattle. But he is also best known for a history of British birds, and he was actually a really early animal rights campaigner and anti-war proponent, so I was quite pleased to discover that. He's a local lad born out at Cherryburn near Wylam, and you can go and see where he was born because that is open to the public, so definitely worth a visit. But I just thought that was quite cool to see how Thomas Buick sort of fits into some folklore via the natural history route, if that makes sense. If, on the other hand, you get to the top of Cathedral Stairs and you turn right and then go along the back of Cathedral Buildings, you will find our old friend, the Vampire Rabbit, over the central rear entrance. And it was amazing how many people I actually saw coming up the stairs, turning right and then looking so joyful that they had seen the Vampire Rabbit. And that always warms my heart to see that because I think he's wonderful. So that's basically a quick way to find the Vampire Rabbit if you are in Newcastle. Otherwise, though, we are following the Lort Burn, so we're going to head back down Cathedral Stairs, which takes you back down onto Dene Street. I did then cross the road because I needed to be on the other side. That is, of course, the best reason to cross a road. And if you then find on your left between Brewdog and what used to be Pizza Express, you'll find another narrow staircase. And this one's called Painter's Heugh, which marks a stopping point on the Lort Burn. And it is believed that the name refers to mooring ropes known as painters. Dene Street then meets the side just below Painter's Heugh. And this junction also marks the point where a small burn that begins at Blackfriars then meets the Lort Burn. And you'll also see dog-leap stairs rising up along the side of the railway bridge, which takes you up to the Castle Garth area where you'll find the Black Gate and the Castle Keep. Now, despite the name, it has nothing to do with jumping dogs. It actually derives from dog lope, meaning a narrow slip of ground between houses. It's really interesting when you look at dog-leap stairs to imagine there being pubs on either side, which seems somewhat perilous given how narrow and steep the stairs are. But it just, again, shows how much redevelopment there has been in the area. We're not going up dog-leap stairs, though, thankfully. I don't think my fatigue would have allowed me. But anyway, we're then going to follow the side east past the Crown Posada, which does have some claim to be in one of Newcastle's oldest pubs. It tends to be between them and the Old George. And given we know that Charles I apparently drank in the Old George, my money's on them. But that's just a tangent we don't need to follow. Anyway, the road eventually leads round into Sand Hill, and apparently another smaller bridge did cross the Lort Burn at the bottom of the side, and in 1648 musicians allegedly played on the bridge to entertain Oliver Cromwell, who was in town. But Sand Hill itself is one of those street names that we have quite a lot of in Newcastle, where we name things for something obvious. So the side is so named because it goes down the side of the castle, and Sand Hill was so named for the mound of sand left by the tide where the Lort Burn met the Tyne. So it was a hill of sand, so it was called Sand Hill, which I absolutely love that about how we name our streets. It's either something really obvious about the area or it's a person. There's literally no other thing that we name things after, which is quite funny. Now, the city culverted the lower reaches of the Lort Burn in 1646, and then waste dumped into the Tyne created landfill so they could then build on the reclaimed land. So this particular part of the city has been quite busy for centuries. And at one point it hosted a market selling cloth, leather, fish, herbs and bread. And Sandhill was also a popular destination to see bull baiting or public executions. So, bit different from now. But Sandhill is actually the site of a love story that's become a legend despite being surprisingly rooted in fact, which again I thought I'd add as this is a folklore podcast. An Auborn Surtees lived at number 41 Sandhill with his family and hoped for a good match for his daughter Bessie. Now, he was a banker, so he obviously felt that she should marry someone appropriate. But these stories rarely work out like that, and Bessie had met John Scott, the son of a coal trader who had actually been born in Love Lane further along the quayside. Now, Surtees refused to give us permission and forbade Bessie from seeing Scott. And how often has that ever worked in these stories? So Bessie decided to throw caution to the wind and, in 1772, climbed out of the first floor window of the house to where Scott waited on a horse below. And the pair galloped away to elope. Now, the legend part of it kicks in because the story claims that Scott rode up Dogleap Stairs that I showed you just before, which I find quite unlikely given how steep and narrow they are. But they did end up eloping and they got married. Now, the big question is, did Bessie and Scott live happily ever after? And surprisingly, it seems that yes, they did, which is quite nice. And Scott even launched a successful political career and ended up Chancellor of England, becoming Lord Eldon in the process. And for those familiar with Newcastle and its shopping centre, his name is where we get Elden Square from. So when I mentioned Old Elden Square earlier, it's named after him, essentially. So that's one of those rare stories where this actually works out for the best. You can go into Bessie Surtees' house on particular days. I've been in before when the late shows have been on, so you can actually see what it looks like inside, because it is essentially a Jacobean property that's actually been restored. But anyway, once we're on Sandhill, the Lort Burn runs under Sandhill and then under the Guildhall before it discharges into the Tyne somewhere nearby. It's not immediately obvious where it discharges. There is a metal plaque on the side of the Guildhall that says it's somewhere in the area. You can't actually see where it discharges into the Tyne. It's just somewhere around there. And in 1296, someone actually built a 135-foot galley ship at the mouth of the Lort Burn at a cost of £205, and that actually marks Newcastle's earliest recorded shipbuilding endeavour. Because this is the thing with Newcastle, the two things we're most often associated with were shipbuilding and coal mining, although I did discover at one point we were a massive exporter of wool as well. So in terms of our place on the world stage, it tends to be resources that we had that we sold or building ships, which is quite interesting. Now, some sort of civic building has stood on the Guildhall site since the medieval era, and the current building surprisingly dates to the 1650s, but because it was refaced 150 years later, it looks far more Georgian than it actually is. And it is also, as you might imagine, apparently haunted. and one of the more famous phantoms is that of Jane Jameson, a fish hawker and murderess. So on New Year's Day in 1829, she'd been out drinking with William Ellison, but they ran out of money. So Jameson went to the Keelman's Hospital on City Road where her mother lived and demanded money from her. Her mother refused and an argument broke out, which ended when Jameson grabbed a poker from the fire and stabbed her mother with it. The trial took place at the Guildhall, and Jameson initially tried to claim it wasn't her and that Ellison had kicked her mother to death. Now, obviously, there's a bit of a difference between someone being kicked to death with hobnail boots and being stabbed with a poker, and that clearly did not go in Jameson's favour because all the evidence pointed to her. Ellison also had an alibi as well, so it clearly wasn't him. Jameson eventually admitted she might have done it, but was too drunk to remember. And obviously she was then sentenced to death. Her execution drew a huge crowd. Some estimates put it at 20,000, perhaps because she was the first woman to be publicly hanged in Newcastle for 71 years. After the execution, her body was used as a teaching aid at the Barber Surgeons' Hall. Yet, according to legend, people heard a disembodied voice crying out one of the typical street traders' cries near the Guildhall. No one knows why this would be Jameson specifically, because she was a fish hawker and the song was that of a fruit seller, but apparently the song ended with "Bring Billy Ellison to me," which apparently gave Jameson's identity away. Now, the Guildhall does currently stand empty after the departure of the Hard Rock Cafe, but who knows how empty it really is. Obviously, by this point, we are at the end of the Lort Burn, where it does discharge into the Tyne, or who is referred to as the Queen of all the Rivers. And I have to ask the question, was it worth looking for the Lort Burn? And the answer was absolutely. For all it was quite odd to follow a river that at no point I actually saw, it was obviously still worth tracing the route itself. And while I do know the city centre well anyway, navigating it while following the Lort Burn's course gave me something of a different perspective on the streets, how they connect to one another, and where their names come from as well. Now, it's not strictly psychogeography, but I do feel that it's a form of psychogeography because I was navigating the city by following a buried river. And I did feel by doing so that provided a window into the city's history. So it didn't take me into the Roman or Saxon history of the city, which is really interesting, but you tend to find that more over next to the castle. But it did help me to uncover more about the medieval, Georgian and Victorian incarnations of Newcastle. And the river essentially provides that through line to take a wanderer through that history. It was a nice day as well, which helped. I found a lovely bakery called Pure Need on Dean Street, which I highly recommend if you're in the area. And it was just really nice encountering the city in that way and feeling like I was engaging with a part of the city that actually is really important to the city, but it's just a part that we never think about because it's underground and so on, which is quite interesting. So my question to you is, were you familiar with the Lort Burn before I started this episode? Because some people might have heard of it, some people probably won't have. Even some people in Newcastle might not have heard of it, but it is the one that gets mentioned more than some of the others. So I thought it was quite interesting to follow that one, particularly where it intersects with the history of Newcastle around it. And that brings to a close our Folklore of Freshwater theme. Next month we are doing witches, cunning folk and magic, and because I'm going to be away for the last 2 weeks of June because I'm in Florence with work, I am going to be doing interview-based episodes instead. So I have collected some fabulous experts on witches, cunning folk and magic, and we are going to be talking about such things. So next week I will be talking to Tabitha Stanmore about cunning folk, and they're a topic that I feel really does need a lot more exploration by people because it's so interesting. There's also a few misconceptions about it as well. So we are talking about cunning folk next week, and then the week after we're going to be having a look at witches in history and superstition with Willow Wincham. So hopefully you'll enjoy that as well. But anyway, I hope that you've enjoyed all of this. If you do want to become a Patreon supporter, the bonus episode for May was actually Legends of the Hudson River. So I decided to have a look at something in North America instead. So hopefully you'll enjoy that if you are a patron, and that is at the $3.50 a month or higher tier. So hopefully that is good as well. And otherwise, I'll see you next week for our chat with Tabitha Stanmore about cunning folk. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.